What is up? What is going on? Welcome back to the COVID-19 War Room. Welcome back to everyone that is either from my class, a different class, or from a different district altogether. We're so happy that you're here, so happy that you found us. Hopefully going to teach you a little bit of history today about the Reconstruction. We are in part two of Reconstruction today. We're going to jump right into it, so let's get into the computer. So before we get actually started, we need to review what we went over in part one. Whether you saw that video or not, just kind of keep you up to speed. So first of all, Lincoln is dead. He was assassinated in April of 1865. Johnson took over Reconstruction. That lasted for a little while. Then the radical Republicans were able to kick him out and take control over it. So at this point, the South is under military control. We know that Texas is in the 5th Military District. The 14th Amendment of the Constitution has been passed and ratified, and the Confederate states that thought they were readmitted to the Union were actually not. And so we've got every Confederate state except for Tennessee working for readmission into the unit. So 1868 is where we're going to get started. We're going to get started with the election of Ulysses S. Grant, who's going to become the 18th President of the United States of America. Shortly after his election in 1870, the 15th Amendment is going to be passed and ratified. This is going to grant everyone the right to vote except for women, regardless of your race, color, or previous servitude, which is basically means you were a slave previously. 1872, just quickly going through a timeline here. Not much to report back here that really applies to us. Grant is re-elected in 1872 for his second term, and now we have illegal slavery to talk about. So after the Civil War, the plantation owners are in kind of a pickle, to be honest with you. I mean, they've had this labor force that now just got removed and freed, and while that's great for the freed slaves, the plantation owners and farm owners are kind of wondering what they're going to do to keep their money coming. So we get this system called sharecropping, which is basically legal slavery. And well, what does that mean? Well, let's go through it. Okay. So in order to produce crops, landowners turned into a system called sharecropping. So a landowner allowed workers called sharecroppers to grow crops on their land. Sharecroppers were usually freed slaves and poor whites who did not own land. So the sharecroppers are out there working hard. They're working the land, doing everything. Basically, the plantation owners are still sitting back and relaxing on the front porch, drinking a nice cold sweet tea for the most part. And so these sharecroppers are going to come in and they're going to do all the work, and then they're going to give, sometimes half, sometimes 2/3, whatever, a portion of their crops to the landowner, or the profit of the crops to the landowner. Now, this is going to make sure that the sharecroppers stay dependent on the landowner for food, clothes, anything that they need. The landowner's basically going to get it for them, but it's not going to be free. So we can look at some of these pictures as we go through it, and then we're going to get to a cyclical deal of kind of a justification on how you could call it legal slavery. So this is just sharecroppers out here working, picking cotton, harvesting, everything like that. Just pictures, and I really like this time in history because we actually get to see photographs. This is kind of the first time in history that you have real picture camera taken photographs, not just like paintings and renditions. So you can see just kind of the conditions and kind of what they were working with here. So this is going to be a sharecropper shack. Another one there. Kind of inside, you can see this. Basically, the wallpapering is newspaper. Here's evicted sharecroppers, kind of waiting for something to come along. Maybe pick them up. Maybe a train, take them on to the next town. Hopefully, they can find some work. So here we get to the cycle of poverty, okay? And this is how I can justify calling it legal slavery, because that's honestly what I think it was. Now, was it by choice? Yes, it was at first. And this is how the landowner is going to get into kind of a legal slavery situation. So, number one is up here at the top. A sharecropper shows up and says, hey, you know, I'd like to live on this land. In exchange, I'll give you half the crops. And the landowner says, all right, perfect, yeah, that's great. Okay, well, then you go to step two. Sharecropper buys food and clothing on credit from the landowner. Okay, not so big deal, right? But now your percentage of profit just went down, because now you owe that person even more. So maybe you're supposed to give them 50% of their crops. Well, guess what? Now you're giving them 75% to pay for your food for the year and your clothes. Okay, no big deal. I mean, 25%, you're still going to make a little money, right? All right, here we go. Sharecropper plants and harvests the crop. Like I said, does all the work. Sharecropper gives landowner crops to sell. Sharecropper will get half the earnings minus the cost of his purchase of the year. When it's time to settle up, the sharecropper owes more than he's earned. Okay, did he actually? No, probably not. But the landowner knew that, you know, probably a sharecropper is not going to be somebody that's educated, so can't probably do math. So they could tell him basically anything they wanted. And so that sharecropper is then going to have to, in order to pay their debt, make a promise for a greater yield next year, right? So if this year, okay, we started at 50%, and then we bought our food and clothes for the year, so now we're giving up 75%. Oh man, we owe you 105%, right? Like we're short 5% of whatever we were supposed to pay. So next year, okay, same deal. We're starting at 50%. That's fine, but you know, we got to make up that 5%. So we're starting at 55%. Buy our clothes and our food. Now we're at 80%. Okay, so it's just going to become on this ongoing cycle. And so next year, at the end of it, the landowner is going to tell him, well, now you owe me 10% because you didn't make up the 5 from last year, and the 5 from this year is still not. You didn't make that up either. So now it's just going to compound and compound, and eventually, you know, these sharecroppers are never going to get out of these cycles of poverty, and until basically sharecropping is over and done with, and that's not really going to come into the Industrial Revolution. So, and finally by 1876, Reconstruction is coming to an end. Most of the former Confederate states, except for 3, which are South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, have rejoined the Union, and everything is looking up as far as getting everybody back into the Union is concerned. And then we have the election of 1876, which is Tilden versus Hayes. And this is kind of an interesting one here, because Tilden wins the popular vote, but if you know anything about our electorate, we don't have a popular vote system, right? We have an electoral college system. So for Tilden to win the whole election, he needed one more electoral vote from South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, and then they voted 8-7 to give the electoral votes of South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana to Hayes. And so Hayes is going to win the presidency when Tilden was literally one vote away from winning that election. And so the Democrats are going to protest, but Hayes is going to be president despite losing the popular election. But that's how our system is designed. So then we get the Compromise of 1877 out of that. And so Democrats are going to agree to allow Hayes to be president and kind of, you know, be quiet about it, not be angry, not raise a fuss. But all the remaining federal troops would have to be removed from the South. And so the Democrats, you know, they're coming from the South, so they're going to concede the presidency to a Republican, but they're going to get something out of it in exchange. So, all right, look, we'll let you have the presidency, that's fine, but you're going to take all these soldiers out. You he's going to have to elect Democrats to his cabinet. So Secretary of State, Vice President, Secretary of Treasury, all that is going to be the presidential cabinet. And the Republicans would support a southern transcontinental railroad route, which means it basically goes from sea to sea on the railroad. So they're going to get a lot out of it for just giving up the presidency, which is going to actually benefit the South way more than probably just having a president would. So Reconstruction is officially over, and that is super exciting for the United States as a whole, not really the citizens or anything like that, or the freed slaves, but the fact that everybody's back into the Union is a good thing. So if you look at this map, this will tell you when the state came back into the Union. So you can see Texas 1870, Louisiana 1868. That little date down there is when they came back into the Union. If they don't have a date on them, they were already in the Union, never left. Those kind of an orange color here, those were the territories that are eventually going to be added into the Union. But Reconstruction is officially over, but things aren't really well constructed in the United States at this point. So once Congressional Reconstruction ended, the military ended. All three phases of Reconstruction, as far as military, presidential, and congressional, are done. The southern states just started passing laws in their state, and so they made state laws where, like we talked about in part one, you've got a literacy test to start to be able to vote. So if you can't pass a literacy test, if you can't read and write, as a freed slave, there's not many that can, you're not going to be able to vote. So that, yes, you are allowed, there's a law that says you can vote, but then they passed this law that says you can vote if, right? They're still not taking away your right to vote. Just learn how to read, right? That's probably what they said. Oh, you can vote, just learn how to read. Well, it's not that easy, all right? If you think about it, it takes, 7-8 years to learn how to read? From baby to 7, you probably can read very well at 7. And they probably gave them this just super hard test just to make it so they couldn't be able to vote. So it's one of those things like, yeah, you're letting them vote, but you're not really letting them vote. Okay, there's another one here. It's the poll tax. So basically kept the poor out from voting. So in order to vote, you had to pay a tax, right? It could be a nickel, it could be $1, it could be $20, whatever dollar value they needed. And it's not for everybody, right? Let's be real. And if it was for everybody, like if somebody was watching, the rich people would just give everybody all the white people money to go and pay their poll tax so they could vote. So it's a corrupt system that we have here, and it's not really fair to the free slaves and African American, but it is what it is. We also have the grandfather clause, which is an exemption of poor whites from the literacy test and the poll tax if their grandfather had been eligible to vote. So your grandfather could vote. There was nothing, no literacy test, no poll tax. You're still poor. You're white. Nobody ever taught you how to read. You didn't own a plantation. But they're going to put this in there because your grandfather was able to do it. So coming on, those laws right there were known as black codes and Jim Crow laws, and they're basically state ordinances that further restricted the rights of African Americans and promoted segregation. And so those state and local laws limited the effectiveness of the 14th and 15th Amendment and remained there until 1964. So we're talking about almost 100 years. We're going to go through suppression of racial groups, African Americans, black people, and really, a lot of different racial groups, but mainly African Americans in this time for 100 years based on these black codes and Jim Crow laws. So the 14th was obviously citizenship, and the 15th was the ability to vote. And so they're going to make it very difficult to do this. So one of the things that kind of keeps this trend going is the fact that the Supreme Court upheld separate but equal, which is Plessy versus Ferguson in 1898. And so Plessy versus Ferguson was a case that was brought to the Supreme Court and said, hey, we have these rights as African Americans. The Supreme Court said, yeah, you absolutely do. And they said, well, separate but equal, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, right? Do both African Americans and white people have a water fountain? Yes, right, but they're separated. So the Supreme Court says, all right, you can have separate things as long as you have the same separate things. Okay, this is where the front of the bus, back of the bus, right? Can everybody ride a bus? Yes, but the front of the bus is air conditioned and the back of the bus is not, right? And so you get into this separate but equal, and they're going to uphold this in 1898, and that's kind of going to continue the trend of segregation and persecution. So just some pictures as we finish up here. We got the water fountains, which we saw, and then colored waiting room there, and there'd be a sign for a white waiting room. So that's it. That's all. Reconstruction is done. It's over. We are almost to the end of these COVID-19 videos. Almost to the end. We got one more unit to do. But I'm happy that you're here. I'm happy that you're learning. Hopefully you're getting something out of these. If you are, go ahead and drop this video a like. Thank y'all for watching. Hopefully you're staying on top of your schoolwork and everything is going swimmingly. If you need anything from us, do let us know. We'll see you in the next one.